Hey everyone. Today I would like to do kind of an in-depth study on the Article 5 Convention. These are some notes that I've put together for a presentation for anybody that's interested. I'm hoping this will be of interest to you. If it's not now, perhaps it will be soon before your Constitution is gone. This is an issue that has been fought for probably 4 decades in a variety of different degrees that we'll go into. And I wanted to make sure that I could inform people about our perspective, which is really quite rare. The perspective that I possess, and I will openly state that is absolutely 100% consistent with the position of Eagle Forum and the John Birch Society, and it is the path less traveled, considering so many conservative talking heads are in support of this. What it clarifies to me is that the American people have been led to believe that we should trust experts, that somehow, if the majority rules or the majority believes in something, that somehow we should believe that. The irony of that is that most of those people that I know are patriots. They believe in individual liberty and they detest the collective, but yet we end up adhering to the collective when they give the words that we think that we want to hear with addressing issues that we think will fix them. So without further ado, I'd like to be able to go through this. We have a lot of problems today. We have awakening and people becoming awake. We have a lot of fear. We have a lot of haste. People really want to be able to make quick decisions and to be able to get the kinds of things done in an expedient way so they can go about their way and work on either other multitudes of other issues, or go back to sleep, or whatever the decision might be. Go back to work, take care of your kids and your family. Hey, that's a concept. And we have to understand there's a lot of confusion. There's decisions and consequences. There's a lot of divisiveness that I'm seeing among our groups too. And overall, I think it's safe for all of the leaders that I know that we're suffering from tremendous apathy. And I think part of that comes from not really understanding or feeling bold enough to be able to step out. Now, this is something that I'm doing that's stepping way outside of my comfort zone. You guys have no idea. But especially doing this in public with having live BDIs pointing at you. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how this turns out. I would like to also say that, what we should be focusing on instead are things like patience and eagerness and education and accuracy and a wide open periphery of our political landscape. I think that's hugely important. If we can understand, if it's an elephant or a gorilla in the room, I think that might be helpful to us. Should we do something or shouldn't we? And really, what is our frame of reference on, and what is that reference based on? If it's based on emotion, if it's based on, well, I want to rein in the out of control government. I openly admit I don't know anything about the Constitution. Could you be easily led to believe or led down the primrose path that'll end up in darkness? And I think a lot of Americans, if they were honest with themselves, would openly agree that that's the case. So, this is going to be surrounded by, if you will, imagine a conversation with the Convention of States group supporters and myself, as in my personal capacity, as well as my position as a JBS coordinator. And I believe, for the sake of brevity, that where we both agree, the COS and JBS agrees, is that the founders did in fact create Article 5. There's no question about that. The federal government has grown to become abusive beyond these ends, and there must be a means to control that. Those are all things we totally agree on. Where we disagree, however, that never seems to come up, is the fact that nobody's really questioning the purpose of Article 5. What was it actually put in place for? Was it put in place for, like the COS says, to, rein in an out-of-control government? Or was it used to be able to maybe, fix errors in the Constitution? So that's one area. Would it work? Would the Article 5 Convention work to the desired end that we hope it would? Why arguments by the supporters are inconsistent? And really, my question that I added in here on my own was, what is the bigger picture? What really is the whole motive behind moving towards a constitutional convention? Is it to openly abolish the convention and institute some other form of government? if you have any belief in conspiracy at all, you would have to consider those elements. And sadly, COS, in my communication with most of them, don't acknowledge that at all, and instead call me a conspiracy theorist, tin-hatted kook. So I would like to be able to go into things that are a little bit important, because we talked about the importance of the frame of reference. There's been a lot of confusion about the John Birch Society in general. It was founded in 1958, and its focus being on history and current events, the Constitution, and the conspiracy, not conspiracy theory. And it is history a solid position because they've seen the bigger picture. They've seen the head and the tentacles. They realized the conspiracy to undermine America, while Americans brought into the propaganda campaign by the Communist Workers Daily in their article, Enter Stage Right, the John Birch Society in the 60s. The article was reprinted by Time magazine sometime later. So you can see that the John Birch Society has also understood clearly about infiltration, propaganda, and as well as who our enemies are as well, while we have to endure smears. So that's where the story of the smears against JBS came from. JBS on agenda items in general is summed up in basically two things. One of them is challenging for us to be able to keep up with the number of smears against us and the variety. Number two, and one of the most critical points as you consider this presentation, is while a charge or a quote may only take a sentence or two to propagate, you're racist, you're a homophobe, you're a bigot. Refuting it might require a considerable amount of space and time. Well, when you have an organization like ours that tends to do that, and you have a public that has a very diminished, ability to attention span, it becomes very difficult for people to understand the method of who we are and what we do. So the first fabrication is that the statement about us is that the president of the John Birch Society, Larry McDonald, endorsed the Constitutional Convention. That's false. He did not in any way support the Constitutional Convention. And I'm going to summarize that by saying he did endorse the Liberty Amendment formulated by Mr. Willis Stone, but did not support a convention. I can go into more detail, but I'm not going to. The JBS position on opposing Article 5 Convention is wrong because our country's founders all endorsed a constitutional convention to amend the Constitution. Yes, our founders did endorse a constitution. They put Article 5 in there for the purposes of amending our Constitution, for fixing errors, not to rein in an out-of-control government. The concern with JBS that we had was not related to the convention. It was related to its end result and the process that it was going to undergo and the final result. Fabrication 3 was JBS has joined the left in the support of a convention. This is a really funny one, and we'll expose this later. Mark Meckler has told me that several times. He's openly said it on the radio, like somehow the left doesn't support the convention, which will show that that's false. The claim actually proves that the left would support the means to support a call for convention, which is completely inconsistent to what Meckler, an attorney, actually stated. There are organizations on both sides that support the convention, and it isn't a matter, it's just because they support conventions for different reasons. We can all choose to be able to support a provision or oppose a provision, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're taking a anti-American approach necessarily. So Article 5 for the Constitution basically is the 5th article of the United States Constitution, Article 5, and it's the amendment article. It provides 2 methods for proposing amendments to the Constitution and 2 modes of ratification. The framers of the Constitution created Article 5 in order to provide for a peaceful and orderly method to correct any defects or errors, such as a lack of safeguards of people's unalienable rights, etc. The Congress, now listen to this, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses deem necessary, shall propose amendments, or on the application of legislatures of 2/3 of the states, Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which, in either case, shall be valid to all intents and purposes as a part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of the state of three-fourths of the states or by conventions thereof. The reason why I added emphasis here is because that the Convention of States group likes to be able to likes to say that the states have full control over the federal government in the methods and processes of an Article 5 convention. I'm going to go ahead and reiterate this for you about what we just read. Congress shall propose amendments or on 2/3 of the application by state legislatures. Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments. The states ask for permission to the federal government by submitting these applications to have this convention. The convention, therefore, proposes the amendments. The states, 3/4 will ratify the amendments or by conventions of 3/4 thereof. And Congress calls for the mode of ratification. So what that looks like is that Congress has three powers. The states have 2, and the convention really has 1. Additionally, the Congressional Research Service report, both in 2012 and 2014 that I had read both, has something pretty interesting to be able to say. Now, this is the kind of documentation that's used for Congress to be able to understand how something would happen if something were called in, like the Article 5 Convention. And it clarifies 6 responsibilities, and I added one, that Congress assumes when it calls to convention. One of them is receiving, judging, and recording state applications. The other one is establishing procedures to summon a convention, determining the number of electors and process for its delegates. Number 5, setting internal convention procedures, including the formula for allocation on votes among the states. Arranging for the formal transmission of any proposed amendment to the states. Number 7, determining the mode by which proposed amendments will be deliberated by the states for ratification, either through the submission of proposed amendments by the legislatures or by conventions held for that purpose in each of the several states. Now, what this basically says is those are all the things that the Congressional Research Service acknowledges that Congress assumes power for once the convention has been called, not the states. So let's get into the weeds a little bit. What is an Article 5 convention? Well, the Black's Law Dictionary in 1910 defines the Constitutional Convention as a duly constituted assembly of delegates or representatives of the people of the state or nation for the purpose of framing, revising, or amending the Constitution. The 5th edition basically goes on to say an Article 5 convention is, in fact, a constitutional convention. Well, COS says that the Constitutional Convention isn't an Article 5 or an Article 5 isn't a Constitutional Convention. I think it's pretty clear on what it actually is. So what is a Constitutional Convention? A convention, now I just told you what an Article 5 convention is. Now I'm going to tell you what a Constitutional Convention is. A convention is a formal gathering of deputies or delegates chosen and recognized by the people they represent for a common purpose. It is a sovereign function as defined by proposing amendments, plural, to the Constitution. Therefore, with it being a superior deliberative standalone body, it cannot therefore be limited. So what we'll go ahead and do is talk about who calls a convention. Under Article 5, Congress calls for the convention when 2/3 of the states apply. States do not call for convention. The only power that is guaranteed to the state legislatures in the convention method is that of applying and making an application to Congress for the convention. And I can go into further details and probably won't for the sake of time. Is it a convention of states? Now, this is kind of an interesting topic. An Article 5 convention is a federal function, not a state function. It's called by the federal government to amend the federal Constitution, as much as it is, and it is not a function of state governments. An Article 5 convention is a federal constitutional convention. An Article 5 convention is not a convention of states. There is no such thing as an Article 5 convention of states because I just read to you what Article 5 actually said. Not only is the phrase Convention of States nowhere to be found in the text of Article 5, but prior to 2013, hardly anyone ever referred to the Article 5 Convention as a Convention of States. Enter Robert Nadelson in a speech. He basically said that I think we should call it that, or perhaps an Article 5 Convention, Amendments Convention, or a Convention of States. Meckler and COS are claiming that the terms Convention of States and Constitutional Convention have completely different meanings. On their website, COS states that it's not a convention of delegates, but it's a convention of states. Well, one other thing to consider that I have rarely ever seen is that we have a private group of state legislators that has undertaken the task of making rules for the future CONCON. Under the name Assembly of State Legislators, ASL, they purport to emulate the 1786 Annapolis meeting regarding the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation, discussing amendments for ratification. That would seem illegal to me. Now, what could replace our Constitution? Well, we've got a few choices here. We've got the Constitution for the New States of America, published in the book Emerging Constitution in 1974 by an avowed socialist, Rexford G. Tugwell. How about the Constitution for a New Socialist Republic in North America, published by the Revolutionary Communist Party? How about a new Constitution for the United States, also known as the Democracy Constitution, published in Democracy Journal of Ideas, considering we're a republic? Here's another one. Let's give one to the Libertarians. The Libertarian Constitution, published on the website of the National Constitution Center. Now remember this, NCC. And the Progressive Constitution, also published in the NCC's website. Now remember, I just got through telling you NCC and Libertarian. Now listen to this. Robert P. George, NCC, on November 8, 2021, while participating in a roundtable discussion, organized Pennsylvania lawmakers. Mark Meckler identified Robert P. George as being the COS's legal advisory board. By then, he'd already co-authored the Conservative Constitution for the NCC's Constitution drafting project to replace the current Constitution. They're already talking about replacing it. In Section 12 of his conservative Constitution, here's one provision. States shall make no law to enforce any law infringing on the right to keep and bear arms. Sound good so far, right? Of the sort ordinarily used for self-defense and recreational purposes, provided that the states and the United States, in places subject to its general regulatory authority, may enact and enforce reasonable regulations on the bearing of arms and keeping arms by persons determined with due process not to be dangerous to themselves or others. I prefer the founder's vision, but that's an option for you in a conservative one. What about ratification? Now this comes up quite a bit. The mode of ratification is only relevant when the amendments come out of the convention. If the convention delegates draft an entirely new constitution, it could contain its own mode of ratification, like we did with the new Constitution when we replaced the Articles of Confederation, which had unanimous consent, 13 out of 13 states, and the new one was 3/4 of the states. What if we just did like 3 out of 15 or 3 out of 50? Would that be good? So it's really not a safeguard. 3/4 of the state legislatures thought it would be a good idea when they ratified the federal income tax, the 16th Amendment, and the direct election of senators in the 17th Amendment. And if you love filing and paying income tax to the federal government, you can thank the 3/4 provision that is the safeguard that they talk about. One thing to consider, too, on a note that I like to talk about, shall we review the motive and intent behind other amendments that, instead of limiting the federal government, expanded it? Now, you can look at some of these amendments, and you can look at what seems to be quite clear to me, where the earlier amendments did more to be able to regulate Congress, to be able to limit Congress to certain few and defined powers. And then later on, after, maybe the 10th Amendment, something like that, they start going into the federal government taking more control over the states with the enact of slavery, and due to the Reconstruction Acts, which is a completely different can of worms, going into direct taxation, removing the direct election of senators, and moving us more into a democracy than maintaining our Republican form of government. And things like alcohol and prohibition, and we can go into some of those and to be able to talk about what really happened, and was the support of any of those working toward the subversion of our Constitution. Well, there's always a question about a runaway convention. They say that there's no way that there could be a runaway convention, even though that there was a precedent for a runaway convention before. When the delegates met in 1787, the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation was completely eliminated with the replacement of a new constitution. That's enough. And then they changed the ratification process from unanimous consent to 3/4. So can they exceed their limits? They certainly have. Our founders have openly stated that they had, and they look at any further conventions as dangerous. Now let's consider a precedent, or a couple of things. Under our new Constitution, there's never been an Article 5 Constitution convention, right? Because the only convention that we had was to replace the Articles of Confederation and replace it with our Constitution. What about what they say that each state's going to get one vote? How would that work? If each state got one vote, and wouldn't the larger cities and the larger states that have much bigger populations want the equal representation that they believe in their mindset that we live in a democracy rather than a constitutional republic with limited, few and defined separations of power and checks and balances? If people don't have any understanding of the Constitution, then they could be clamoring for things completely outside of that. And in an effort to be able to have a Constitution, they could arguably allow that provision to be included, which could be dangerous, which would take away equal representation while attempting to offer it. So I have a separate worksheet that I can't go through with you right now. It basically gives every talking point that the Convention of States has, and it gives our answers to each one of those. One of the provisions that we have been, or one of the statements that we have been told by the Convention of States is that, and I told you this earlier, is that there are no leftist organizations that support a CONCON. And the fact that the John Birch Society opposes the CONCON is somehow aligning with the left. Well, that would be interesting, but let's take a look at some of these names. So some of the supporters on the right are Convention of States, Term Limits USA, Mark Levin, Ron DeSantis, Judge Napolitano, lots of Republicans, ALEC, BBA Task Force, Compact for America, and Call for Convention, which claims to be nonpartisan. But on the left, we have Common Cause, which is a Soros-funded group, Young Turks and Wolfpack, also Soros, Move to Amend, Lawrence Lessig, The Nation magazine, which is a communist rag, the National Popular Vote, the Harvard and Texas A&M law school professors, several of them, Democratic states like Hawaii and Connecticut, Democrats, the Call for Convention, again, which is supposed to be nonpartisan, Convention USA, Amend.org, Article5.org, and Americans United to Build Democracy. Now that you can see that we've dispelled the fact that it's not just the right that supports a CONCON, the left does too. The interesting thing to talk about is who opposes the Article 5 Convention. If there are that many people that support it, then who opposes it? Well, the John Birch Society does. John Birch Society always has. And the Eagle Forum. And now Glenn Beck. I wonder why Glenn Beck decided to change his mind. Here's some of the statements that have been made by the Convention of States. In a private conversation and on air, Marcus stated that the JBS aligns with the left and that the JBS opposes a convention. Meckler has also stated that there are no leftist organizations supporting a convention, which I've shown that to be false. Meckler and the Convention of States are claiming that the terms Convention of States and Constitutional Convention have completely different meanings. On their website, COS states it is not a convention of delegates, it's a convention of states. They also define a convention of states to mean an Article 5 convention limited to amending the Constitution. The claim that a convention of states is only for amending a constitution, whereas the term constitutional convention they define to mean a convention exclusively for framing and writing a new constitution. COS's false distinctions between the Constitutional Convention and the Convention of States has gone a long way toward convincing state legislators that the Convention of States could never exceed its limited authority and draft an entirely new constitution. But one thing to consider, and I try to keep things simple, is whether they claim that it's an Article 5 convention or it's a convention of states, they are still using Article 5. I can go into some detail about COS according to Michael Ferris regarding George Mason. They basically said that George Mason kind of came out and said, yeah, we should be using this when the government becomes abusive. But what he really basically stated was that neither Mason or the framer of the Constitution said anything of the sort. What Mason did say, as mentioned earlier, was that Congress may become oppressive and not agree to the amendments. That's a big difference, because it doesn't necessarily say he calls for a convention. He could have supported the other mode, which would be the states' application for amendments. So, without going into too much detail there, although I can, let's look at some warnings from the past. Madison had warned of the strategy to use amendments as a pretext for a new constitution. Our founders and others have stated the dangers of a convention. I have a list of historical evidences I can review with you. And so what have we learned in history, even just you and I, on trusting the experts? Where has that led us? Well, usually it leads to things like follow the money. Should we trust local or out-of-state attorneys and advocates without even knowing their motive? Or should we just trust them because what they're saying sounds good? And why would Mark Meckler condemn our own state legislature, which he has? He's condemned your representatives because they didn't support the COS on one hand, while Mark knows that he needed their support on the other to allow it to happen. And why did Mason, Hamilton, and John Jay write over 80 essays in the New York Packet? To inform the electorate. Why is it that so many people today are so uninformed? Because there's no way for the people to even be aware of what these people are working on behind closed doors. And what I mean by that is not as open as they did when they were writing essays in the New York Packet. A few considerations on term limits and the balanced budget amendment. It all goes back to this, guys. What is the root cause of the problem? Is it the unconstitutional spending and taxation, or is it the problem with the Constitution? I would say that it's probably because of the unconstitutional spending and taxation. So if that's true, then why would we opt to amend the Constitution when the Constitution isn't even the problem? Why would a state apply for a BBA while they take federal money? BBA since the 30s have always sought to shrink the size of governments, but never to bring them into compliance with proper spending and enumerated powers. The BBA would legitimize usurpations by focusing on the goal of balancing the budget and ignoring usurpations. Would it cut or eliminate bureaucracies? With huge federal and state deficits and the rise of national debt, would a BBA raise taxes to pay that debt to the Federal Reserve that is an unconstitutional entity anyway? A BBA would not bring the federal government into compliance. If we are in perpetual war for perpetual peace and we have been under a national emergency for decades, would we suspend the declaration or the escape clause allowing for unlimited spending during such time? Will the BBA abolish the Federal Reserve or repeal the 16th and 17th Amendments? Will it address conspiratorial issues like global reparations paid for by the U.S. for our carbon footprint while communist countries are free to do as they please? So let's talk a little bit about term limits. What is the root cause of term limits? Is it the violation of their oath, or is it the Constitution? Term limits were in the Articles of Confederation and removed from the Constitution because they had realized that it didn't work. Term limits limited the people and removed both good people and bad people that were in office. People should be able to vote and keep good representatives. To me, it violates the law. The good are punished without cause, which one could argue is preemptive law and a admission of guilt before innocence. Our founders stated that we have a government we deserve. I think that's pretty clear. Madison stated that we should have frequent elections to preserve good behavior. People in state governments benefit from federal money. Representatives would be reluctant in restricting their own power like they were in Idaho. Opening the Constitution to a convention is a can of worms. The solution is the ballot box. The goal should be replacing the politicians, not the Constitution. And the term limits ultimately for the legislature are frequent elections, and term limits for the judiciary and the executive branch are impeachment. So let's look at a few more questions regarding term limits in the Balanced Budget Amendment. How will we address the 5-year implementation provision? Does a budget passed every year by the supermajority prove that the states wouldn't support a BBA? Would states and feds be willing to cut spending and increase taxes to cover more than $100 trillion in national debt? How would a BBA be successful knowing that money buys votes? How much money do we or will we need to spend on calling for a convention and finalizing the outcome? Many progressive organizations support a BBA, even if they're always clamoring for more money. Let's look at a few facts. The use of a convention for a BBA is a misuse of Article 5. The calling for a convention under Article 5 defies logic, consistency, law, and is reckless. The states cannot control or regulate or limit the Constitution. Robert Natelson even admits that the convention is a deliberative body and up or down votes will be subject to legal challenges. In 1985, the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act was bypassed because reductions could not be met. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 obligates Congress to pay debts, which is the first thing to happen before we have a balanced budget. The United Nations has openly and repeatedly strongly suggested that the U.S. pay more money to empower the UN and subsidize third world countries, which is an equal distribution of wealth. Madison stated delegates are given greater latitude than Congress and can be undermined by hidden agendas. An Article 5 convention is for fixing errors in the Constitution. History has always made clear the dangers of haste, man's desire to control, and that man was a creation of God, not the other way around. Many proponents admittedly attack the wisdom of God and our founding fathers. Proponents will never say the Constitution is flawed. They never say that the founders screwed up. They say the Constitution is the problem. And we say that the Constitution is the solution. A few considerations regarding the conspiratorial elements. Do COS proponents acknowledge conspiracy? No. Most say I'm a kook. If follow the money is an important phrase, why is there little interest in understanding organizations that are not well funded? If these conspiratorial elements are thought not to exist, how can they or will they fix our current issues? How did the Federal Reserve come to be? Was it related in any way to the 16th and 17th Amendments? Will they address the Federal Reserve 16th and 17th Amendments? Will they deal with the conspiracy of globalist, transhumanist technocracy? Will they deal with digital ID, mass surveillance, radical environmentalism, or direct people to focus on the branches rather than the root cause of the issues? Will a convention remove the World Economic Forum and the UN and the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission from controlling global politics and economies? Will they prevent or remove treaties or trade agreements like the TPP, the TTIP, or the USMCA? Will Article 5 wipe out the behemoth administrative state? Will they control the rising control of healthcare and the military-industrial complex? Why won't they acknowledge conspiracy? So if not Article 5, then what? Well, the John Birch Society has always stated that education and having an educated electorate and having an educated and active electorate is the recipe for a long-standing free government. Nullification is firmly grounded in the text of the U.S. Constitution. Article 6 binds state legislators, along with the members of Congress, judges, and all other officers at large with their oath to support the Constitution. Article 6 also states the Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. State legislators are required to uphold and implement only those laws that are made in pursuance of the Constitution. And any laws not made in pursuance thereof are no law at all. So what do I suggest? I suggest having a Constitution solution workshops in your home and in your communities. And you can read our material, whether through membership or not, watch our videos, learn history while staying up to date on current events, staying polished on your Constitution, and developing a clear understanding of the elements of conspiracy that we now know exist. So what have we learned ultimately? Article 5 is for the correction of errors or defects in the Constitution. An Article 5 convention is a federal constitutional convention. A convention is the ultimate embodiment of a sovereign will of a people at large through their selected delegates who possess the power to rewrite the Constitution. A standalone, autonomous, deliberative body. The convention method was added so that Congress was not the only body to propose amendments, and it was never meant to rein in the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Congress calls a convention. An Article 5 convention is not a convention of states. Ratification by 3/4 of the states is no safeguard against bad amendments. Nullification under Article 6 is the only constitutional remedy for the states to stop federal tyranny within their borders, and an educated electorate is essential in safeguarding liberty. So what I like to do is try to keep it simple. As I finalize here, I think it's important to do that. What is the root cause of the problem? Is it the federal government or is it the Constitution? What is the issue? Defects in the Constitution or the Fed's failure to adhere to their oath? In a Republican form of government, who creates the government? According to the founders, who is the safest depository against the abuse? It's the people. Thomas Jefferson stated that. Do words themselves have any enforcement power? Will the words of a new Constitution hold them to their oath? If words had enforcement, taxpayers could save millions abolishing law enforcement agencies in their entirety, could we not? Could the only thing that is in the way of our global common future, our Constitution, when it was openly stated by many that they wish to comfortably merge the United States with the Soviet Union through the abolition of sovereignty in favor of regionalization and political and economic integration? How does this idea comport with the most recent new declaration for North America? If you were married and 50% loyal, would you change your contract or hold your partner accountable? If the people weren't adhering to the Bible or the Ten Commandments, should we then just rewrite those too? The Constitution already sets limits on the federal government via enumerated powers. The notion that amendments can be used to limit or restrict powers that were never given to the federal government by the Constitution in the first place, or that an Article 5 convention can be used to regulate the behavior to those that are already in violate of the Constitution, is itself illogical. And I appreciate you guys for listening to my conversation. I will eventually at some point stand for questions.